The next group of organisms we want to talk about are the fungi. We're discussing them with the plants because at least partially they're plant-like, but as you'll see, this is a very confused group. They're sort of half plant, half animal, and since they don't really fit very well with either group, they're put on their own and considered in their own separate kingdom. They're not really plant-like, even though we can see them growing like plants because they lack chlorophyll. That means they can't photosynthesize like plants, therefore they're not autotrophic. In fact, they are heterotrophic. That is, they have to feed on nutrients outside the body, that is, in this case, from the organic matter on this forest floor. As heterotrophs, the majority of them are saprophytes, absorbing nutrients directly from the forest duff, that is, all this organic matter. And there are a few types that are parasitic, and we'll talk about those types a little bit later on. They are plant-like in that they do, at least some of them do, form cell walls. But again, the contrast, the conflict, although some form cell walls, the cell walls aren't composed of the cellulose that you normally find in plants, but are composed of chitin, which is more of an animal-type compound. For example, it's found in the exoskeleton of arthropods, like crayfish. Fungi represent an enormous group. It includes molds and yeasts and mildew, and it includes all of the mushroom types, puffballs, bracket fungi, and of course toadstools or the common mushrooms that you see growing in the forest. Fungi are very important. They are major decomposers within the environment. Now, we've already talked about the bacteria, which are one group of decomposers. The fungi are the other group. In fact, on the forest floor in front of me, there are different types of fungi that are getting their nutrients from this organic matter, like this rotting log, and at the same time, they're decomposing this wood material or leaf material, breaking it down and recycling the basic nutrients. The thallus of the fungi plant is composed of individual filaments called hyphae. In a very primitive form, such as this one on the log, the hyphae, the individual filaments, are obvious. In the more advanced ones, like this mushroom, the hyphae are banded together, and that is very closely intertwined, to form the stem and the cap of the mushroom. Reproduction within the fungi is primarily by spores. Fungi form both sexual spores and asexual spores. Some of the life cycles are very, very complex. Now, the next thing we want to discuss are various types of fungi, some that are edible, some that are toxic, some that are beneficial, and some that are parasitic. And for that discussion, we'll go to another area of the forest. This is our concluding lecture in the segment on bacteria and fungi. And in this lecture, we want to talk about different types of fungi that are found in the environment. As I mentioned in the last segment, you're more familiar with fungi in regards to mushrooms or, for example, these bracket fungi on the log in front of me. But there are a wide variety of other fungi that we want to take a few moments to talk about. First, fungi that are parasitic. You may be most familiar with a couple types parasitic on man, for example, ringworm, not a worm, but a fungi, and athlete's foot. But there are a lot of parasitic fungi that are devastating on agricultural plants. Two types are called rusts. One, seed or apple rust, the other, wheat rust. Both of those can devastate either apple crops, making apples basically unmarketable, or on wheat, it can actually destroy the wheat plant. Both of these rusts are very hard to control because they have alternate hosts, that is, other plants that they'll parasitize, and because they have 2 or 3 spore stages, so it's very difficult to isolate and control these parasitic fungi. Other types of parasitic fungi that are fairly significant is a type of fungi on corn called smut, a purple growth that really is smutty looking. Although it is not harmful, it destroys the quality of the corn, and then certainly, I certainly wouldn't want to eat it. I don't think you would either if you saw this purple fungi growing on the ear. Saprolegnia is a parasitic fungi on fish. Hatcherymen refer to it as sap. It forms a white coat on the fish, and if left unchecked, it's eventually lethal. It can devastate hatcheries. Another parasitic type of fungi caused the Great Potato Famine in Ireland, genus Phytophthora, that was responsible for thousands of deaths through starvation. There are a lot of edible types. Probably the two most significant are considered gourmet fungi, or gourmet mushrooms. Morels that grow in North America in the wild. They have a very difficult time trying to grow them commercially. A morel hunter guards his secrets. Whenever he finds them, he tells no one else. That's how good they taste. Truffles, a European variety that grows underground. Obviously very difficult to find. So they use animals, truffle dogs or truffle pigs, to locate these fungi. The pigs have an added incentive to finding the fungi in the chemicals secreted by woods. Another toxic form, truffles, smells like a sex attractant secreted by boars or males. And therefore females or sows actively dig up these truffles thinking they're going to find a male to mate with. But many of the fungi are toxic, and you have to be very careful when you're out in the field, if you ever try to gather mushrooms to eat, that you know the difference between edible and toxic forms. There's a great deal of what they call mimicry, that is, where toxic and edible forms have evolved to look very much alike, and it can be very dangerous. Probably the worst of them is the genus Amanita, that's known as the destroying angel. This one is so toxic that if you consume too much of it, you can die before you ever get out of the woods. Another toxic form is claviceps. Claviceps is a parasite on the grain rye. Claviceps produces lysergic acid, better known as LSD. LSD is responsible for thousands of deaths in the Middle Ages from eating rye flour, contaminated, and was undoubtedly responsible for thousands of cases of madness. There are beneficial types as well. Penicillium, obviously that fungi is what penicillin, the drug that kills bacteria, is derived from. Aspergillus. This is a genus of fungi that's used to ferment rice, wine, or sake. Aspergillus also produces a toxin, though, called aflatoxin, that's found in peanuts and corn, and eating peanut butter that's contaminated can be lethal. Most of these, by the way, that are toxic contain nerve toxins. One of the most unique types is a very primitive type of mold or fungi called a slime mold that they're now using a chemical from to treat the spread of cancer. This slime mold secretes a sex attractant into the environment that groups or gathers together, corrals their sex cells for reproduction. Well, they're now using this same chemical to keep cancer cells from spreading. In other words, the chemical gathers together the cancer cells, prevents the process known as metastasis. We're going to be talking about a variety of plants and animals during the course of the semester. I think it's worth our while to take some time to talk about organization within life forms, starting from the simplest types of organisms, or organization, excuse me, and building in complexity with each succeeding level of organization. What we'll be talking about is what is known as the biological spectrum, or the spectrum of life. The most basic level of organization within this spectrum is the substance or liquid of life, and that is protoplasm. Protoplasm is present in all of the cells in all living organisms. It is composed primarily of three components. The dominant component is water. That substance we'll talk about later in the semester, so unique to life on this planet. The second major component of protoplasm is inorganic compounds and the ions that compose those compounds, ions such as calcium or phosphorus or nitrogen, many others that we'll talk about later. The third major component is organic compounds. including such things as protein, lipid, carbohydrate, and nucleic acids. Protoplasm is incorporated in discrete units, in fact the most basic functional unit in the spectrum, called cells. Cells are present in all living organisms. Our bodies, for example, are composed of literally millions of cells. Cells that perform a specific function are grouped together to form tissues. For example, skin tissue is composed of a whole variety of different types of epithelial cells, all performing a similar function, that is, functioning as our epidermal layer, or our skin. Above the tissue layer is the organ level of organization. At this level, we're talking about a group of tissues performing a similar function, forming the organ. For example, the organ, the heart, is composed of a variety of different types of tissue types, including, obviously, cardiac muscle tissue, neural tissue, epithelial tissue, and other types as well. All of the organs together form an organ system. An example of an organ system, we could use the endocrine system, probably one of the most complex systems within organisms, higher organisms that is. The endocrine system is composed of a whole variety of different kinds of organs or glands, such as the pituitary, the hypothalamus, the thyroid, the gonads, and others. In higher organisms, these organ systems combine with each other, integrate to form the organism, that is, the individual, what is also known as the species. All organisms have a specific name, a scientific name, composed of a first and last name, that is, a genus and a species name. For example, we, as man, are known as Homo sapien. The yellow perch, a fish, is known as Perca flavescens. All organisms have this genus species name. Organisms that interact in a specific area of the same species form what is known as a population. Now, for organisms to belong to a population, they must interact. For example, a population of white-tailed deer in the Hudson region. Now, Michigan has white-tailed deer as well, but they are not a part of the same population as Hudson Valley white-tailed deer because obviously those in Michigan and those in the Hudson Valley don't interact. Populations that interact in a specific area form the next level of organization, known as the community. The community is one of the basic ecological study groups that we'll talk about during the course of the semester. Community involves populations, as I mentioned, that interact. For example, think of a pond community. In a pond community, there are populations of fish, of invertebrates, of plants, of certain types of amphibians, all of them interacting, affecting each other's life, and forming the community. Above the community and ecological organization in our spectrum of life is the ecosystem. The ecosystem is the largest functional unit in natural biology. By functional, I mean it can be studied as a unit. The ecosystem includes the community, but it also includes factors we refer to as abiotic factors. Abiotic meaning non-living factors that affect the biotic factors or life within that community, or in this case, within that ecosystem. These abiotic factors can include such things as sunlight, temperature, moisture concentration, and a variety of other types of abiotic factors that impinge on life forms in that habitat. Above the ecosystem is the largest grouping in the biological spectrum, and that's the biosphere. The biosphere includes all life on this planet. That is, all organisms below the surface of the Earth, on the surface of the Earth, in the air above the Earth, or in the water on the Earth's surface. So starting with protoplasm and building through the following successive levels of organization: the cell, tissues, organs, organ systems, the organism, populations, communities, ecosystems, and finally the biosphere. This is the biological spectrum.